During this video, I'm going to talk once again about class implementation. We're going to revisit a lot of the same topics that I talked about in the last video, but I want to do that because this is just such a vitally important topic, and I really want to make sure that we have a really thorough understanding of it before we move on to anything else. So I'd really encourage you to watch this video through, write down any notes, anything that stands out, and then of course you can always email me any questions that you may have. So let's just get into it. As you hopefully recall, a class is a blueprint for creating objects. The blueprint includes three things: attributes, which we call instance variables, methods, and then of course constructors as well. That's really what we're going to dive into deeper today, what these three things are, how we write them, and what their purpose is. So for this example today, we're going to write a student class. And as we've already said, a class is going to have characteristics, constructors, and actions. So constructor, we're going to have a default and a packed constructor just like we have in the past with our rectangle class. For characteristics, you'll hopefully remember that a characteristic is a property. It's something that describes an object of this class. So for our student class, we're going to keep it very simple, and we're just going to have two instance variables, and we'll name them name. So the student will have a name and then a GPA. That'll be it. And then finally, we'll have to write our methods or actions, and we're just going to write four methods: get name, set name, get GPA, and set GPA. So that's what our class implementation is going to look like. Let's get started, and we will start with the characteristics. So instance variables, call them characteristics, but instance variables in Java are used by objects to store their state. What do I mean by that phrase when I say store their state? Well, let's go back again to our student class. Once we write our student class, we're going to create instances of that class. So we might say something like student S equals a new student. Now in that case, S is an object, and that student object will have a name and will have a GPA. That is the object's state. So it's the values that describe the object. I'm not sure of a better way to say that, but we'll look at some examples, and I hope that will clarify it. So again, they're defined in a class outside any method, constructor, or code block. And each instantiated object of the class has a separate copy or instance of that variable. So again, let's take a look at our instance variables. Well, actually, let me just, before we do that, remind you that we'll call instance variables a number of names: instance variables, instance fields, properties, and again, I've already referred to them as characteristics, and I'll do that as well. So I have the starting point for our student class here. Right now, all I've done is declare it. Let's start by adding our instance fields. Okay, and again, we know that these can be called instance variables or properties. Okay, help if I could spell. Okay, so we're going to add two properties, and instance fields are always private. We'll talk about what that private reserved word means in a future video, but for right now, once again, just know that we need to make them private in Java. And the first one that we're going to include is going to be a string. So I'll say private string name. And what I just did is I just declared, of course, a variable. This variable is private. Its type is a string. And its identifier is name. So that's it. It's declared. It doesn't have a value yet, but we've declared it. Next, we're going to say private let's make it a double. GPA. Alright, so I've just declared a second instance field, and this one's going to be a double, and its name is, of course, GPA. So that's it for our instance fields, at least the declaration part. Right, we've just created our two instance fields for our student class. Alright, let's go back over to the PowerPoint here. And this next piece that we're going to write are going to be the constructors. A Java constructor is a special method that is called when an object is created or instantiated. It's an important word. I should have made that word orange, instantiated. The purpose of a Java constructor is to initialize the newly created object before it's used. A constructor is called when you use the new keyword. And we'll get into that last sentence in the next video when we talk about actually creating instances of a class. But for right now, again, we're just concerned with the implementation. And in the implementation, we're going to need to write two constructors. The first would be a default constructor. A default constructor does just what its name kind of implies. It creates a default instance of this class. So you're just giving it some sort of default values. What those default values are really up to you. But it's important to know that a default constructor does not have any parameters. And again, you're just going to supply default values for an object. The other type of constructor that we're always going to write is called a packed constructor. A packed constructor is a constructor that is a parameter for each of the class's instance variables. Now you can write other constructors as well if you would like to, but these are the two that I'm going to ask you to include in basically every class. So let's go back over to our student class and we'll write our constructors now. Okay, so we've got to write two constructors. The first one that we're going to write will be our default constructor. And our default, all of our constructors always start with the reserved word public. You have to make constructors public for the most part. And then the name of a constructor is going to be the same as the name of the class. So you can see I'm writing the implementation for class student. The name of my constructor is also going to be student. All right, now the purpose of a constructor, we said, is to initialize the newly created object before it's used. Or maybe I should have gone back here. Well, it doesn't say it but explicitly, but the idea is we have to provide values for each of the instance fields. A student has to have a name, a student has to have a GPA. So we need to provide default values for these two instance fields. So we can just make up any sort of default value that we would like. So I'm just going to make my default name Joe, no reason. And then the GPA for Joe, or Joe's GPA, will be 0. Sorry, Joe. All right, so that is my default constructor for my student class. The other type of constructor that we have to write, as I've already said, is a packed constructor. A packed constructor is going to have a value or parameter for each of its instance fields. So once again, we're going to make it public, and the name of our constructor has to be the exact same thing as our class, and we're going to provide parameters for each of the instance fields. So I have string name, or string n, which I'm going to use to initialize name, and double G, which I'm going to use to initialize GPA. So in my packed constructor, I'm going to initialize each of these values. So I'll say name is equal to name, or excuse me, n. And of course, what I'm doing here is when you call this packed constructor, you're going to pass it a value for n. Inside of the constructor, I'm going to set name equal to whatever that value is that they pass it. And I'll do the same thing for GPA. So GPA is going to be equal to G. And there it is. Those are my two constructors, my default and my packed. And we need to include these with every single class that we're going to write. All right, finally, the third and last piece of writing our classes are methods. So we've been writing methods for a while. The idea of writing a method isn't new. But in the context of a class, it is kind of new. So there are generally two types of methods that we're going to write. The first are known as accessors or getters. These methods return the state of an object. It just gets you information about an object. The other type of method is a modifier. They're also known as setters or mutators. These methods change the state of an object. So you'll use these to alter an object. All methods that we write are going to fall into one of these two categories. We're always either getting information about an object or changing the information of an object. So let's write our accessors and modifiers. Now this class is going to be incredibly simple. So we're just going to write two accessors and two modifiers. And again, accessors always get information. In fact, I'll write the other name. They are also referred to as getters. So at the very minimum, we need to have access to each of our instance fields. So let's start there. Our accessors and modifiers or methods are always going to be public, just like our constructors. So I'm going to first write a method to get the name of a student. So since name is a string, my return type is going to have to be a string, and I'll say public string get name. And all I'm going to do is return name, and that's it, right? So when I call this method, basically what I'm going to do is say, I'm just going to ask an object what its name is. So I would say the name of the object, let's say I said student S equals a new student, right? I created a student object. Then I could just say s.getName, and that will return S's name, all right? So there's getName, and then let's write our other accessor. We're going to write a function now that gets your GPA. Now since GPA is a double, this function of course needs to return a double. So I'll say public double get GPA, and I'll just return my GPA. And that's really it for my accessors, right? All I'm doing is getting information about each of those properties. All right, let's go down now to our modifiers. All right, so we know that modifiers are also known as setters, and you'll also hear them referred to as mutators. All right, so the reason why they're given these names is because they do modify, they do mutate an object, they do set a value for an object. All right, so once again, at the very minimum, we need to write a setter for each of our instance fields so that we can change an object's information or an object state. So just like above, we're always going to make these public. Now setters are always void. What does void mean? Void means that it just doesn't return anything, right? It's not going to return any sort of value. It's only going to change the value. So I'm going to say public void set name, and I need to pass it or supply it with a name to change it to. So I'm going to say string n is going to be my parameter. And once again, just like I did in the constructor, I'm going to simply set name equal to this parameter value, right? So name is going to be equal to this parameter value. And then I'll also write a modifier for my GPA. So I'll say set GPA, and my GPA is a double, so I have to pass it a double, and I'll just say GPA equals G. And that's it. That is the basic implementation for my class. It's pretty straightforward, right? So let's just touch on one more topic very quickly, and then we'll be finished with this video, and that is the idea of comments. All right, so we all should know that writing comments is incredibly important. It's really vital that we can describe what our code is doing for other writers. It also helps us to keep our thoughts organized. Now, at the top of each class, I'm going to ask you to include these 4 lines of comments. They look really familiar, at least they should, because we've done something similar with our other projects. Our main class always had a similar 4 lines of code, but I'm going to ask you just to put these at the top of our classes. So you can see we're going to write the name of the class, the author, the date, and the description. And I do ask that you use this syntax that you see in front of you. So let's do that for our student class. So I think the first thing that we're going to do is say class, and the name of my class is student. The second piece of information is the author, so we'll say written by Mr. Swope. Date, I think today's date is the 27th, so I'll say April 27th, 2020, and then a description. Okay, now this is probably the most important of the 4 lines of comments, so even though, well, this class is pretty basic, so I don't know that I'll have a ton to write, but in general, we do actually want to describe what it is that our class is, well, its purpose and what it is. So I'm just going to say this class provides the implementation for a student object. A student object will have a name and a GPA. And that's, I think, about all that I'll include for this class. for this class's description. Okay, so we need those 4 lines of comments at the top. The next thing we need is to provide some commenting inside the class. So inside the class, I've already done this, but I'll just want to point it out. I want us to always identify the instance fields, the constructors, the getters, and the setters. So what do I mean by that? Well, you can see right here, I'm just identifying that here are my instance fields. Now, you don't need to give all the names. It's okay to just use one. If you want to say instance fields, if you want to say variables, if you want to say properties, I don't care which you choose, but just identify it. Next thing that we need to identify is our constructors. You don't need to explicitly identify the default and the packed if you don't want to, but just point out that we're writing our constructors. Okay. After that, we're going to identify our accessors, and you'll notice that I do group my accessors together and I group my modifiers together, and I want you to do that as well. Helps keep your code nicely organized. Just like before, if you don't want to include both names, you don't by any means have to. Same thing for down here with the modifiers, all right? So just give me one name, whichever name you choose to use. I don't really care, all right? So that's the second type of commenting that I want you to include with each of your classes. And then finally, the last piece that I'll ask you to include, and it doesn't really apply to this example, is if you write any methods that are outside of the order, just the normal getters and setters, so getName and getGPA are doing nothing more than getting a property, and just like setName and setGPA, they're doing nothing more than just setting a property. If you include any sort of methods that kind of step outside of those normal straight get and setting methods, then I want you to include the same 4 lines of code that we've included with methods up to this point. So for this, I'm going to go back to our rectangle class that we wrote in the last video, and I'll show you an example, right? So here I have my typical setters and getters, just set width, set height, get width, get height. But here are 2 methods that I think are a bit out of the norm, right? So I'm getting the area and getting the perimeter. Not terribly advanced, but yeah, it's worth mentioning. So here I'm going to ask you to actually write those 4 lines of comments. So the methods get area, the description is method will calculate, and I'm sure I spelled that wrong, calculate, man, can't type, and return the area of the object, of the rectangle. There we go. Okay, parameters, there aren't any, none. And then the return is a double, which will be the rectangle's area. All right, so I would do the same here with get parameter. I'm not going to take the time to do that right now. But again, get perimeter is doing a little more than just returning one of the instance fields. It's actually doing a calculation, so I'd ask you to, once again, return those. To include those 4 lines of comments. So that's it. I hope this helped. Again, email me with any questions that you might have.